Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you very much to Professor Park to offer me this opportunity. I'm very glad. I'm really, really glad to meet you all and then speak with you in the graduate students in the communication and media department. So I'm Yoonjin Ro, and I'm a research professor at Korea University right now. Today's talk is titled Navigating ESG and Sustainability in the Age of Climate Risk, Perspectives for Media and Communication Researchers. Well, before we begin, I want to be upfront about something. So my own research is focusing on climate disaster risk. So I study how cities manage climate hazards like flood or extreme heat, and how the governance makes certain groups of people more exposed to those hazards. So I'm not like ESG specialist per se, but I think that's why today's conversation might be more interesting, because I'm approaching ESG from a little bit of outsider's lens. And I want to share that lens with you and see how it connects to what you work on in the ground, okay, in this field. So here is the central argument I want to build today. ESG is not just a corporate reporting tool. It is a communication arena. That's how I see it. A space where corporations, governments, journalists, and civil society negotiate questions of responsibility, credibility, and accountability. For scholars in media and communication, that makes ESG an exceptional rich subject, I think. And we will move through today 3 interconnected themes. So first, how climate, because I study climate risk, how climate change came to be understood as a systemic risk. Second, how ESG emerged as one way of respond to that risk. And third, probably the most relevant for your work, what happens in the gap between what corporations say about their sustainability and what society expects from them, okay? So, first things first, why are ESG and sustainability everywhere right now? If you look at these headlines, one from Food Industry Magazine and one from Bloomberg, you can see that ESG has moved far beyond the world of environmental policy. It is now a mainstream business concern. Companies compete for ESG award. Industry platforms track sustainability commitments. And this is just from the past 3 or 5 years. A decade ago, sustainability was largely a niche theme of like environmental NGOs or some socially conscious investors, a few progressive companies. Today, however, it appears in stock market filings, government regulations, in advertising campaigns, like everywhere. Of course, in media coverage. Then, let's think what changed. Well, stakes changed, okay? Climate change stopped being a future problem and started affecting present financial decisions. Investors began asking, is this company exposed to any climate risk? And regulators responded, companies must disclose that risk, any climate risk they are facing. And the public demanded, show us the evidence that you guys are doing something. So, but as ESG expanded rapidly, so did skepticism about it. Some say ESG improves corporate transparency and accountability. But at the same time, others argue that it has become sophisticated, their reputation management strategy. So companies talking the right language without actually fundamentally changing what they are doing. This tension between like genuine accountability and strategic communication is exactly what makes ESG interesting for researchers in your field. And ESG's influence does not come only from metrics or ratings. It comes from how sustainability is communicated and framed and debated in public discourse. And that is the lens we will use today. And to understand where we are, we first need to understand how we got here, starting with the rise of climate risk as a systemic challenge. So, before we dive into it, let me briefly outline how today's talk is structured so you can track the argument as we move through it. We will cover 4 main parts today. So the first part is the broader structural context, the age of climate risk. Over the past 2 or 1 decade, climate change has increasingly been understood not simply as an environmental issue, but as a systemic risk that affects economic systems, financial markets, and governance institutions. Understanding this shift is very important because it explains why sustainability became such a central concern for corporations, governments, and investors today. And the second part is it looks at institutional responses, specifically how corporations adopted ESG strategies and how governments and regulators introduced disclosure requirements to them. And the third part, is where the most interesting questions for your field may emerge, what I'm calling the ESG communication gap. Even though ESG frameworks emphasizes transparency, communication around sustainability is shaped by competing incentives. That's the reality. So corporations, journalists, NGOs, and policymakers all play a role in this space. So we'll talk about it a little bit. And then the fourth part, finally, we will consider what all of these means for you guys, the media and communication researchers. So what kind of questions we can navigate or think about. With that overview in mind, let us start with the foundation. What climate change came to be understood as a systemic risk? Okay, so for most of the 20th century, climate change has framed primarily as an environmental problem, like ecosystems, biodiversity loss, pollution, and etc. These are important concerns, of course, but they were largely treated as separate from the core logic of business sectors and finance domains. That framing has shifted substantially over the past decade, and climate change is now increasingly described as a systemic risk, and that shift in language matters enormously. So then, like, what do we mean by systemic risk? Well, a systemic risk, it may vary depending on people who define, but I see it as that risk is something spreading through interconnected systems. So a shock in one place may have cascade effects into other sectors gradually. Think about a major flood. It does not just damage buildings. It disrupts supply chains and then may strain insurance system and affect financial markets and cascade through the broader economy and society, right? So that's kind of a systemic risk, what I'm saying. And this is exactly what the chart on this slide shows. Sorry for my apologies for the little text, but I marked there. So this is from the World Economic Forum 2026 Global Risk Report. Look at where extreme weather events sits on the top right corner, right? Meaning high severity, the x-axis, and then short-term high severity, and then long-term high severity. meaning it's just getting worse, not getting better over time. Yeah. So climate-related risks now dominate the top of this list year after year. And then more importantly, the other risks surrounding them, the other red box there, biodiversity loss, critical changes to Earth systems are deeply interconnected climate change as well. So they are all like high severity phenomena. And once climate change is understood as systemic risk like this, it becomes a governance problem that corporations, investors, and governments cannot ignore anymore. It starts reshaping how institutions think about long-term planning, investment, and accountability. Actually, I prepared this activity, but my deepest apologies because I cannot connect my laptop here, so I cannot see the results. But you can try. You can still try. Take out your phone and then just to go to the QR code and take a screenshot of that and then type it. What comes to your mind when you hear climate risk? And although I cannot check the result, you can tell me in person, okay? And then I'll show the word cloud during our lunch. Has anyone typed it already? Just first insight. What did you type? Global warming. Okay, good one. And what else? Disaster. Okay. And misinformation. Good one. Yeah. And what else? Anything else? Long-term crisis. Yeah, good one as well. Okay, so global warming, misinformation, disaster, long-term crisis, all of these. Just 4 answers, but we can tell that climate risk is not one-dimensional thing, neither one-dimensional thing nor one-side thing, one thing. Okay, it connects. It has a very multi-dimensional impacts in our interconnected society. But since we cannot check the results right now, I will introduce the 4 main characteristics that usually people in finance or economic domains tell about key characteristics of climate risk. There are many more, but just 4 major climate risk characteristics. So first, it is systemic. Climate impacts do not stay one place, as I told you from the flood example, right? A heat wave, on the other side, simultaneously affect public health and then labor productivity of the society, and energy demand and urban infrastructure. And this network diagram from the, again, World Economic Forum illustrates exactly that. Risks are not isolated events. They are connected. A climate shock in one part of the system triggers cascades throughout. And you see that this diagram is from the report from 2014. I used the old one because World Economic Forum stopped using climate change as one term. They now like dissect various dimensions and then use separate terms, like as you saw on the earlier slide. Okay. Okay, so systemic, the first characteristic. And then second characteristic is it's a long term. We had the similar answer or response, long-term crisis. Some climate events are sudden, like hurricanes, floods. Yeah, they are sudden. But many of most consequential pressures unfold over decades or even over centuries. Like think about sea level rise, shifting precipitation patterns, and gradual warming trend, global warming. So this creates a fundamental mismatch between long-term environmental change and the short-term cycles of economic decision-making. The third characteristic that involves deep uncertainty. Climate science provides strong projections about trends, but the precise timing, location, and precise, accurate magnitude or frequency of specific impacts are genuinely very challenging to predict. And that uncertainty makes planning harder and gives some actors an excuse to delay their actions. And fourth, climate risk is cross-sectoral. Well, some of you may question what's the difference between systemic risk and cross-sectoral. Systemic risk, by that, I meant it's affecting over time, like cascading effects. And then cross-sectoral means literally multiple domains, policy, public health, economic, finance, education, and those kind of things. So what we see, the cross-sectoral characteristic of climate risk, we mean that we see that it connects environmental process of economic systems, and then social inequality, governance structures in ways that cut across traditional policy boundaries. And because of these characteristics, climate risk cannot be managed through environmental policy alone, like the past. It requires coordinated responses across multiple institutions, like including governments, financial systems, and corporations, of course. And this institutional dimension leads direct to the question of ESG. All right. One of the most significant shifts in recent years has been explicit recognition that climate change is financial risk. Not just simple systemic risk, it's now financial risk. When climate risk enters financial language, it changes who is responsible for addressing it and how addressing it. And let me give you a few concrete examples. So look at this image. It's a flooded industrial facility from Hurricane Milton in 2024 in the United States. And this is what physical climate risk looks like in practice. Infrastructure submerged, and then operations halted, and toxic chemicals released to the community. Events like this cause direct damage to corporate assets and rippled through surrounding communities and local economies. And this kind of disruption does not stay local, of course. Extreme weather events can cascade through global supply chains because we are living in a global society right now in very dramatic ways and multiple ways. A single damaged port, a flooded factory, or a blocked transportation corridor and manufacturing industries thousands of kilometers away may have the impact. Climate risk crosses borders throughout the interconnected system of global cities, global trades, and global communities. Climate impacts also drive up losses in insurance markets. So as extreme weather events become more frequent and severe, insurance companies facing mounting claims. So which changes how risk is priced across the entire financial markets. In some regions, market assets effectively uninsurable. Then there is the concept of stranded asset, an idea that has become very influential in climate finance. So stranded assets are assets that lost economic value because of environmental regulations, technological changes, or shifts in market conditions related to climate policy. The clearest example is, imagine a company that owns a large coal or oil reserve. Those reserves have significant book value right now, right? But if the global economy transition toward low carbon energy, which governments has committed to these days, those reserves may become economically unviable before they can be actually fully extracted and sold, the things from there. So they become stranded. And this is not just a concern for energy companies. Banks, pension funds, and institutional investors with significant exposure to fossil fuel industry face the same risk. This is why the concept of stranded assets was so important in pushing financial regulators to take climate risk more seriously. And because of this kind of risks, central banks, financial regulators, and institutional investors began treating climate change as a systemic financial issue. And once it entered the domain of financial risk, it began reshaping how corporations and institutions think about long-term strategy. So creating the conditions for framework like ESG emerge. Even when institutions recognize climate risk, they face a structural problem. What Mark Carney, the former governor of Bank of England, called the tragedy of the horizon. The person on the right side, the current Prime Minister of Canada right now, he served the governor of Bank of England in 2000, about like a decade ago. He gave a landmark speech in 2015 using this phrase, tragedy of the horizon, and it captures something that had been difficult to address or articulate before. The idea is elegant, but troubling at the same time. Climate change unfolds over a very long time. We already talked about this. Long-term horizons, often decades, generations, or even centuries. But in the institutions that govern the economic and political decisions operate on much shorter timescales. Like, think about it. The financial markets focuses on quarterly earnings, right? Annual earnings. Corporate management systems prioritize annual performance indicators. Political cycles typically run 4 or 5, like maximum, usually, those years. None of these are well designed for managing risks that will materialize fully over 30, 50, or 100 years. And this creates a structural incentive to underinvest in climate action today, even when the long-run costs of inaction are clearly larger. By the time climate risks become fully visible in economic systems, it may already be too late to avoid those severe damage at that point. So on the left, you can see the website of the initiative called Tragedy of the Horizon, named after Carney's speech. So on the 10th anniversary of his speech, it was last year around September, so less than a year ago, September 2025, over 60 organizations from around the world, not corporations though, but mostly NGOs, research institutes, advocacy groups, they jointly signed a public statement calling on central banks and financial regulators to move beyond voluntary framework toward binding action. And their core message was this: disclosure has produced better information, but not meaningful action in behavior of corporations. The financial system is, in their word, still actively fueling the crisis it claims to be managing. So recognizing this time horizon gap led policymakers, financial regulators, and investors to search for mechanisms to bring future climate risk into present-day decision-making. And this is, at its core, what sustainability frameworks are attempting to do. Not to eliminate uncertainty, but to integrate it. So to make long-term environmental risk legible enough that it can influence decisions being made right now by institutions operating on quarterly and annual cycles. And that search is a big part of why ESG gains so much traction today. So, if the core problem is mismatch between long-term climate uncertainty and short-term institutional priorities, the question becomes, what does it look like when institutions actually try to close that gap? That is what we turn to now. The next question is, how did institutions respond? In many ways, climate change created what we might call an institutional gap. For a long time, corporations and financial markets did not have clear mechanisms for incorporating the environmental and social risks into their decision-making, technically. Traditional corporate governance focused mainly on financial indicators like revenue or profit margins, operational risk, those kind of things. So environmental and social issues were treated as something external concerns outside their core logic of like their business operation. But as climate risk became more concrete and more visible, more felt through extreme weather events, policy changes, and growing investors' concerns, this separation became increasingly difficult to maintain for them, and for us, society as well. Investors began asking new questions, therefore, that existing frameworks could not answer. How exposed is this company to climate transition risks? And how might new environmental regulations affecting long-term profitability of this corporation? Are companies managing environmental and social risks responsibly? At the same time, governments and regulators demanded greater transparency about environmental impacts, and civil society, us, applied pressure on corporations around carbon emissions, labor practices, and supply chain conditions. What emerged was converging these pressures from multiple directions at once. In short, institutions needed mechanisms to do three things. Maybe more things, but three things, I would say. Integrate environmental risk into their business evaluation, assess corporate responsibility in systematic ways on their own, and guide investment decisions toward long-term sustainability. And this is a crucial point. ESG did not appear because corporations suddenly became very virtuous. It emerged as a response to a genuine governance gap. It's their living strategy, an attempt to integrate environmental and social considerations into economic decision-making. And understanding this origin helps explain both ESG's influence and its inherent limitations. So let me briefly walk you through where did ESG come from, actually. The term gained visibility in the early 2000s. A widely cited landmark report in 2004 2004 from the UN Global Compact titled "Who Cares Wins." Yeah, the report title tells it. The report argued that environmental, social, and governance issues should be considered when evaluating companies and investment opportunities. And the title itself, "Who Cares Wins," was a deliberate provocation to the financial community. Responsible investment is not charity. It is good business. So that's the argument of the paper. And at this stage, ESG was primarily, at that time, primarily discussed within the financial community after this report released. Investors were beginning to recognize that environmental and social issues could affect long-term financial performance, and companies that ignored environmental risk might face regulatory penalties. And poor labor practices could lead to reputational damage of those corporations, and weak governance could increase corruption risks, those kind of things. And the real acceleration of ESG then came after the Paris Agreement in 2015. Some of you may be familiar about the Paris Agreement. It's a multinational agreement on the global climate goal. So when governments around the world committed the climate goal, investors suddenly had a very practical problem. How do we think about carbon exposure? Because the global climate goal is about carbon emission. And then the investors also think energy transition risk. How do we think about those kind of things? What a low carbon economy means for our portfolios. ESG frameworks expanded rapidly to fill the need. Here's the key conceptual point I want you to take away. So if I were summarize the essence of ESG in one phrase, in a communication sense, it would be a translation mechanism. What I mean by that is it translates broad sustainability concerns, so climate change, labor rights, corporate accountability, into the language of financial risk and investment criteria. That translation is precisely why ESG became so influential, but it also explains another type of tension. When you translate something complex and political into metrics and ratings for ESG, you inevitably lose something in that translation process. So I would say what gets measured gets managed. But what cannot be measured, they often get left behind. And this is why we need a structured framework. To make sustainability more manageable for financial world, we had to categorize these vast environmental, social, and governance aspects, the issues, into specific, more measurable buckets. And this is where this ESG components comes out. Let me quickly map out of the components here. So many of you guys already know, but let me say, if sustainability is the philosophy or their long-term goal, I would see ESG is the metrics. Okay, but I'm not saying ESG is just some simple metrics, but here, by seeing these components, the environmental components focuses on issues such as carbon emissions, energy use, biodiversity, loss or impacts, and resource management. And there are many more, but I just listed a few of them. And these indicators capture how a company interacts with the natural, actual physical environment. That's the E. And then S, social dimension, includes labor conditions, workplace safety, supply chain standards, and relationship with communities, human rights. Yeah. And then G component, governance, dimension focuses on how corporations are managed and overseen, broad accountability, executive compensation, and transparency and regulatory standards and those kind of things. In practice, ESG can cover an enormous range of issues. So as you can imagine, that actually captures so many dimensions and so many things in our society and environment. That framework organizes these complex issues into quite compatible categories, like a measurable bucket. And the key function of this ESG is to make sustainable more measurable and comparable between the corporations, which is what allows it to enter financial decision making. But that function also creates a real challenge. Not everything that matters about sustainability can be easily measured, right? You can see that, right? Already see it, right? They are the components. It's hard to measure. And what gets measured tend to shape what gets managed, as I said in the earlier slide, and sometimes at the expense of what matters most. So ESG designed as a measurement system, but as we'll see, the metrics are just the surface. What matters is how they are used, interpreted, and contested. That's probably the point of our conversation today. Something important has happened over the past decade. So ESG has moved from being largely voluntary to becoming part of formal global reporting standard, like binding these days, actually today. This is a significant shift worth understanding carefully. I don't want you to remember like these key details or the organization's names, but what I want to deliver is that these efforts, international efforts, actually helped kind of like enforcing the transparency for the corporations in terms of ESG. Let me explain. So the early landmark framework was the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures. So I said the acronym there, TCFD. That is an international body of monitoring global financial system. So the diagram on the right bottom shows the TCFD structure. At its core, its metrics and targets. Then risk management, and then the outer circle is strategy, and the outermost layer is governance. And this idea is what this diagram tells is that climate risk need to be embedded at every level of corporate decision making, not just reported as a single number. At the metrics targets, yes, and then risk management strategies, yes. Their overall strategies, yes. There should be, yes, components. And then governance, yes. You have to have those components in the governance strategy. So TCFD was created under G20, the global the countries meeting initiative with a clear purpose. If climate change creates financial risk, investors and regulators need to standardize information about those risks. Companies were encouraged to disclose how climate risks affect their business strategy, how climate governance is structured internally, and what transition plans they have adopted. Over time, the conversation moved further. So this TCFD thing, they ended in 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 or 3 years ago. And then in 2024, responsibility for global sustainability disclosure standards effectively shifted to the International Financial Reporting Standard Foundation, IFRS, which already sets the accounting standards that many countries already today around the world use for the financial reporting. This was a significant move globally. When IFRS created the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSBR, sustainability reporting became integrated into the same global financial infrastructure as accounting. And the ISSB introduced two key standards, IFRS S1, IFSR S2. Just simple. S1 is just overall sustainability related financial disclosure, and S2 is, maybe you can imagine, just climate risk specific strategies. But in our country, in Korea, we are not using this standards. Korea developed its own sustainability standards board, so it's called KSSB, and it developed the national standards based on this IFRS standards. And large Korean companies, not yet, but they will be required to provide mandatory sustainability disclosure on a phase scheduled in 2030 or a few years from now. So ESG reporting is no longer voluntary signal of good intentions. It is increasingly institutionalized into a very formal infrastructure of global finance. And climate risk has entered what we might call the language of finance. And once it enters that language, the communication stakes become much higher. Now, we've seen how ESG functions as a sophisticated data reporting system, because those standards are requiring companies to report in numbers and metrics. But we must look deeper. ESG is not just about the numbers in a report. It is about the legitimacy those numbers are meant to build. At its heart, ESG is a system of trust and communication between a corporation and its stakeholders. So, in that sense, ESG is better understood as a governance, like risk governance. What is the difference between a reporting system and a governance? Well, a reporting system, they produce data, but a governance system shapes behavior. That's the big difference. And ESG does both, actually. And the governance dimension is arguably, and I would say, the more important one. ESG does not just measure what companies do. So it creates incentives that influence what companies do. When large institutional investors incorporate ESG ratings into investment decisions, corporations have concrete financial reasons to manage their environmental and social performance, not just to report on it. And this diagram demonstrates, I inserted here to show how the complex stakeholding relationship or network of ESG. It creates, this diagram demonstrates the stakeholder network through which ESG governance operates. So it is not a simple top-down system, but instead it's investors, regulators, consumers, and civil society all apply pressures simultaneously from many different directions and with different expectations. And once you understand ESG as a governance system, rather than just a simple reporting tool, communication becomes central and very structural. Governance depends on information flows, right? And information flows are never neutral. You may already know. What gets disclosed, how it gets framed, and who gets to challenge it. And these are not technical questions. They are political ones, and which raises a question worth sitting with as we move forward. When corporations say they are sustainable, how do we actually know it? And this brings us to the part of lecture that finally I think most directly connected to you. Okay, now let me shift the lens a little bit. We have established why ESG exists as a governance framework. But if ESG is the framework, how do individual companies or corporations navigate it? Why do they talk so loudly and so much about sustainability? If you visit website of large multinational companies, you will find entire section actually devoted to ESG and sustainability. Detailed sustainability reports, like press statements about climate commitments and environmental messaging integrated into their advertising and branding, marketing. And part of the explanation is simply external pressure. Yeah, that's true actually. Disclosure requirements have multiplied. So public expectations have shifted, and the reputational cost of being seen as environmental irresponsible has risen significantly for some companies. So yeah, there is the component of external pressures, but there are also internal strategic motivation that go well beyond compliance. Sustainability communication helps companies manage their reputational risk. Industries facing environmental criticism, such as energy, aviation, fast fashion, those kind of things, use sustainability messaging to show that they are addressing these concerns and deserve continued public trust. And it also serves competitive positioning. Companies increasingly see sustainability as a source of innovation, differentiation, and long-term growth potential. And being seen as a climate leader in society can be genuinely good for their business. So when corporations talk about sustainability, they are not simply reporting technical data. They are communicating very, very strategically, trying to shape how their various stakeholders perceive their responsibilities and their future business. So what corporations say about sustainability is not only just information, it is also their positioning. It is an attempt to shape how investors, regulators, and the public assign responsibility on them. And the gap between what is said and what is actually done is where things get analytically very interesting. To understand why sustainability communication matters so strategically, it helps to think about the concept of corporate legitimacy. In organizational studies, legitimacy refers to the social acceptance that organizations need to operate effectively. So companies depend on the social acceptance to operate in the society. And that acceptance is not given permanently. It has to be maintained, continuously negotiated, and sometimes actively recovered when it is lost. When companies are perceived as acting responsibly, they tend to receive social trust and acceptance and support. When they are perceived as irresponsible, then especially around like environmental and social issues, they face reputational damage, public criticism, and regulatory pressure. This photograph on the slide captures that dynamic quite vividly, actually. Activists protesting directly connecting the company's investment to climate harm. And this kind of public challenge directly threatens corporate legitimacy. And in the age of climate risk, this dynamic has taken a new weight. Sustainability is no longer simply about being a good company. It is about what is sometimes called a social license to operate. The implicit permission that society grants business or corporations to continue them functioning in that society. So without demonstrating that your business model is sustainable, you risk losing moral authority that are always signaling to stakeholders that the company recognizes its responsibilities. But here is the critical point. Legitimacy is a matter of perception, not just action. Think about it. A company can run world-class sustainability programs, but if they fail to communicate, they lose legitimacy. On the flip side, a company without modest efforts can gain unearned legitimacy through their kind of faking powerful storytelling. And this misalignment between what you do and what people see is very much your strategy, like communication strategy leaves. And that is what we will look at next. When corporations communicate sustainability, they rarely speak in purely technical or regulatory terms. Instead, they construct narratives, broader stories about who they are, what kind of future they are building. And if you look at corporate sustainability reports or advertising campaigns, you will frequently encounter phrases like building a greener future, or accelerating the energy transition, or commitment to net zero, those kind of things. And these are the examples of what I would call sustainability narratives of corporations or companies, rather than simply describing specific actions, actual actions, or data points. Corporations framing their environmental initiatives within a large story about innovation, transformation, and long-term commitments. This kind of strategic storytelling serves several purposes, of course. It helps companies communicate complex environmental issues in ways that are accessible to diverse audiences. Yeah, that's true. And it positions the company as a responsible actor, contributing to solutions rather than problems. And it helps differentiate companies in competitive markets where sustainability increasingly matters to investors and consumers. The example on this slide is BP, British Petroleum, one of the biggest oil company around the world, getting to net zero webpage. I mean, their website, but they have the whole menu of getting to net zero. The language is aspirational. Our ambition is to be net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get to net zero. But notice what this does, actually, guys. It does not say we will stop drilling for oil. It reframes the company's entire identity. Like, we are not an oil company, but we are an energy company participating in global energy transition or climate transition. And whether such commitments are adequate or credible is a separate question. What I want you to notice as communication researchers is how this narrative is constructed, combining scientific language, economic strategy, and aspirational storytelling about their future. And this is what makes sustainability communication a form of strategic storytelling. It is not only about describing current practices, it is about actively shaping expectations and shaping who is seen as responsible for meeting them. So you may be familiar, some of you may be familiar with the net zero. So net zero has become one of the very defining sustainable narratives today. Corporations, governments, and financial institutions have made net zero pledges at a remarkable scale. Are you guys familiar with net zero? Yeah, okay. And actually, it is also the perfect case to observe the discrepancy between bold corporations' pledges and the reality of action. Look at the examples on this slide. So Amazon promotes its climate pledge friendly certification. Apple plans to become 100% carbon neutral by 2030. And these commitments typically appear in sustainability reports or press releases and prominent communication campaigns. And they are designed to signal something very powerful. This company takes climate change very seriously and is aligning its strategy with global climate goals. Yeah, I would think if I am a little naive. On the surface, these commitments can seem encouraging. They represent public acknowledgement that climate change is real, urgent, and very serious, very relevant to their business strategy. But they also raise important questions that are highly relevant for your research, your field's research. How exactly these targets defined? Net zero can mean very different things, depending on what emissions are counted and what role carbon offsets play and what baseline year is used. So two companies can both claim net zero commitment, but they may use a very different standards to apply their commitments. And are their strategies behind these commitments actually transparent? Are there clear interim milestones, or are these distant targets with limited near-term accountability? And also, who is doing verifying? That's also the key of ESG. Net zero pledges operate at the intersection of science, policy, and public relations. Without robust independent verification, actually sustainability claims can function more as communication signals than as binding environmental commitments. And these questions illustrate exactly why net zero pledges and some other pledges of companies are such fertile territory for communication research, because you study how well the narratives and practices are aligned, strategic ambiguity, and how their signals affect the narrative in society, and much, much more. So they are simultaneously environmental strategies and media narratives, these kind of pledges and strategies that the corporations are saying. And the gap between those two dimensions is precisely where critical analysis can make a real contribution, I believe. And this brings us to a larger truth about the entire ESG landscape. I want to be a little direct about something. So ESG is genuinely contested. It's a battleground or battlefield of competing ideas and interests. Why? Well, because there is a fundamental divergence in how we define values by different stakeholders, by different society. Yeah. So this Guardian headline on the right of the slide, right side of the slide, finance firms claiming to save the world may have overpromised. That is a critique from people who feel ESG went too far in making environmental promises that lacked substance. That line of criticism argues ESG is too intrusive. Possible critique too, as you see, particularly in a certain political context. And you may have seen this debate happening in the United States these days. So ESG has been attacked by the government as ideological pressure on corporations and investors. The argument is that businesses should focus on financial performance, just financial performance, not a broader social or environmental risks or issues. But there are also the opposite critics, the possible critic one. That line of criticism argues that ESG is too weak. From this perspective, ESG allows corporations to present themselves as environmentally responsible without fundamentally changing their business models or what they have done. Yeah. Sustainability commitments function as a symbolic gestures to them and sophisticated reputation management that may actually slow down more meaningful structural change. And this is the essential of the greenwashing critic. So ESG is simultaneously criticized for being too powerful or too, being like a toothless, like too weak. That paradoxical position tells us something important. ESG is not simply a technical system. It is a political and institutional ground about how society should govern environmental and social risks. And since the battle on this ground plays out largely through media coverage and public narratives and competing interpretations, it is the battle that communication and media and communication scholars are particularly well positioned to analyze this. So the results we just saw reflect something real in the previous slides. ESG genuinely divides opinion, even among informed people, informed stakeholders. And that division is not just philosophical, it plays out in the way ESG communication actually works in practice. Let me bring these threads together into what I think is a core paradox of ESG communication. So in principle, ESG and disclosure frameworks are designed to increase transparency. That's the main object. Investors should be able to evaluate companies more accurately. Regulators should be able to monitor corporate practices. And the public should have better information about what corporations' responsibilities are. But in practice, corporations also have their own incentives to protect their reputation. And these two goals, like transparency and reputation management, pull in opposite directions. And this diagram captures that paradox. On the one side, disclosure, like transparency, the pressure toward transparency, that one. On the other side, reputation, and that incentive to present information favorably. So companies are pulled between these two forces in every sustainable communication, internally and externally, about their decisions that they are making. If a company fully discloses its climate risks, investors may react negatively. If environmental impacts appear severe, then public society criticize, and maybe that criticism intensify. So companies face a real dilemma: how much to reveal and how to frame what they do reveal. Not revealing, but how to frame what they are revealing. And this creates what I'm calling the ESG communication gap. The space between what disclosure frameworks require and what strategic communication actually delivers. And this gap does not mean all sustainability communications are misleading. Don't get me wrong, I'm not meaning that, but it does mean that communications around ESG necessarily involves choices every single stage about framing, emphasis, timing, and narrative construction in the society. And one of the strategies companies use to navigate this gap is something communication scholars call strategic ambiguity. Am I right? I'm using your word. Yeah, so I found this interesting concept. So strategic ambiguity, and this is the concept that you, as a communication researchers, know far more than me, but bear with me. I feel very humble to describe this concept. So strategic ambiguity refers to deliberate use of language that is broad, flexible, or open to interpretation. It allows organizations to, but in the ESG context, it allows organizations to appeal to multiple audiences simultaneously without committing to specific or verifiable claims about their sustainable commitments or strategies or their efforts. In political communication, in organizational communication, it is a well-documented strategy, and then it's actually well documented. It seems that well documented in this ESG related communication researches as well these days. In sustainability communication, this typically takes the form of broad or aspirational statements. Companies announce goals such as net zero emission, as we already talked about, not net zero commitment. Or they describe themselves as working towards sustainability, but they don't say specifically what they are doing to being towards sustainability. Coca-Cola, I inserted the 3 example images. So Coca-Cola's bottle is advertised as made from 100% recycled material with a small asterisk. Do you see at the bottom? Yeah. It reads, excludes caps and labels. BMW, the car company, promotes its commitment to sustainability next to their cars. Microsoft, they say Microsoft Cloud for sustainability. They emphasize sustainability and their greening commitments kind of thing. But none of these statements are necessarily false, right? They are right. We cannot deny they are false. But they leave important questions unanswered. For instance, when Coca-Cola says 100% recycled material, what about the environmental cost of the recycling process itself, or the cabin label excluded? When BMW or Microsoft use broad terms like commitment or cloud for sustainability, what are the actual verifiable milestones behind those words? Are they talking just about absolute carbon reduction, or they are relying on carbon offset while maintaining business as usual? We don't know with this slogans. And this flexibility is exactly where the strategy comes in. Different audiences read these visuals and slogans through their own lenses and interpret their own views. Investors might see these ads as a signal of long-term risk management, but consumers might think them as a simple green light on keep buying their products. And meanwhile, critics see them as a smokescreen, deliberate vagueness designed to resist their real accountability. And this is the core function of strategic ambiguity in ESG. It allows companies to be everywhere for everyone without being tied down to anything committed. For communication researchers, your role is to make visible what is designed to remain vague. By analyzing these narratives, you can uncover how companies navigate the discrepancy between public expectations and the actual environmental impact that the corporations are releasing. or have imposed on. When strategic ambiguity crosses into active deception, or when the discrepancy between sustainability claims and underlying practice becomes too wide, we enter the territory of greenwashing. And this is where media scrutiny as well becomes critically important, I believe. Let me walk through the two famous examples on this slide, because they pretty different forms of greenwashing. The first is Volkswagen. The Volkswagen's Dieselgate in 2015, so about a decade ago. So regulators discovered that Volkswagen had installed software in millions of their diesel vehicles designed to cheat emission tests. So during official testing, the cars appeared to meet environmental criteria. Under normal driving conditions, they emitted nitrogen oxide pollutants far beyond than the standards, sometimes like 40 times higher. So Volkswagen was marketing these vehicles as environmentally friendly, clean diesel cars. And this image, Volkswagen, the right side, captures the public reaction when the deception was exposed. And the company faced billions of dollars in fines and severe reputational damage across global markets. And this is what we might call hard greenwashing, a direct and systematic contradiction, intentional contradiction between environmental claims and actual practice. And crucially, the scandal was exposed not by Volkswagen's own disclosure, but through regulatory investigation and investigative journalism. The second example is quite different. H&M, you may all know this brand, one of the symbolizing company of fast fashion. They had like conscious labeling. The conscious label clothing line emphasized environmentally friendly materials and recycling initiatives. So critics, like journalists and environmental organizations, argue these claims were misleading. Because fast fashion itself, like that business model, fundamentally cannot be sustainable, like conscious, environmental conscious or sustainability conscious, right? But interestingly, in 2023, so 2 years ago, the U.S. court dismissed the lawsuit against H&M, ruling that any reasonable consumers would not interpret that clothing line as an absolute sustainable guaranteed. But the public and media debate has continued. So yeah, I'll leave it up to you. These two cases together show how media scrutiny and watchdog journalism matter so much for ESG governance. Regulators cannot monitor every claim. Without active investigation by journalists or communication researchers, media researchers, and NGOs, the misleading sustainability narratives can circulate without challenge. And the media is not just an amplifier of corporate messages, it is also a check on them. The greenwashing examples points toward a broader truth. ESG communication is not a one-way flow from corporations to audiences. It is a contested governance arena involving multiple actors with competing interests and interpretations. So corporations, they produce sustainability reports, press releases, ESG disclosures, and framing their environmental performance in ways that serve their strategic interest. And investors, they evaluate those claims through ESG metrics and risk assessment, sometimes accepting corporate framing, sometimes challenging it when financial interests are at risk. And regulators, well, they establish disclosure rules and are increasingly willing to pursue enforcement actions against misleading sustainability claims or their doings. And NGOs, they challenge corporate narratives and advocate for stronger accountability. And journalists, I'm saying here like media and communication researchers, including you guys, they investigate, they examine, they scrutinizing. Citizens and communities as well, us. They sometimes mobilized by media coverage, sometimes bypassed by expert disclosure, they cannot access. So what emerges from these interactions, various stakeholders, is not a single coherent sustainability story. It is a contested field where multiple actors, stakeholders struggle to define what responsibility means, who bears it, and how it should be evaluated. And from a theoretical perspective, this is what political communication scholars in media and communication might recognize as a discourse ground, a space where power is exercised partly through the ability to shape meaning and control narratives. And within this contested space, the role of the media becomes particularly important, I believe, which brings us to the next slide. To better understand how corporate narratives travel through the world, I've also found a very compelling concept in your field. I'm borrowing it again. Information subsidies. So that indicates the materials that organizations provide to the media, the people in the media and communication sector in order to make certain kinds of reporting easier and to influence how stories are framed. And these materials include press releases, media briefings, corporate sustainability reports, of course, and prepackaged data even, those kind of things. So like a ready-made stuff. From a journalism perspective, these materials are genuinely useful, especially under time and resource pressure. So ESG reports can be hundreds of pages usually, and with a bunch of technical terms. But in that case, prepackaged materials reduce the cost of reporting and analyzing. But they also reflect the perspective and framing that the producing organization wants to promote. That's the harm. In the ESG context, corporations produce enormous amount of communication materials, sustainability reports, ESG disclosure metrics, ratings, corporate campaigns, and much, much more. All of these often become primary source for media coverage, not because journalists are uncritical, but because independent verification of complex sustainability claims is genuinely difficult and very time-consuming, to be honest. And this raises a fundamental question. The one on this slide. Is the media a mirror, like a neutral observer, or a megaphone, an institutional amplifier? Is the media independently reflecting corporate sustainability reality, or is it amplifying and legitimizing corporate narratives, giving them reach and credibility they might not otherwise have? And if the media is a mirror, the first one, it should show the flaws and the small print we discuss in the Coca-Cola's case. But if it acts as a megaphone, just like amplifier, it only repeats 100 recycled headline. So the honest answer is, well, it depends. Yeah. Investigative journalism or media and communication research can be deeply critical, I believe, as the Volkswagen case showed. But in many cases, corporate sustainability narratives circulate through media channels with limited scrutiny, especially these days, yeah. Particularly when claims are technical. when resources are constrained or when the information subsidies are very well designed. So, what does all this mean for researchers working in your field? Let me share some possible directions that I think might be interesting. It's just my view, so yeah, but I really hope it helps. The first concern I come up with is the construction of responsibility. So corporations do not simply report environmental data. They construct narrative, as I kept saying, about identity, agency, and their future commitment. How are these narratives built? What kinds of languages, metaphors, and visual strategies are used? And how do these choices shape how responsibility is understood and distributed in public discourse? And the second concern I thought of is power and discourse. So ESG narratives do not emerge from a neutral space. They are produced by various actors with various resources, expertise, and institutional authority and interest, everything. So do corporations dominate sustainability discourse because of their superior communication resources, or others do? We can think about that as well. And then the third is media framing. As I said, is it a mirror or a megaphone? Yeah, so systematic framing analysis of sustainability coverage could answer this empirically, I believe. And then the fourth one is credibility and like a greenwashing thing. How do audiences evaluate sustainability claims, and what factors lead people to trust or doubt the company's environmental commitments? And these are some of the questions that I try to share with you. So let me close with a challenge and an invitation. So throughout this lecture, we have traced how climate risk has been understood, systemic risk, and how institutional responses have emerged. And one way of those responses is ESG. And then we have followed through the ESG narrative and stuff. And what all this means is that the quality of ESG governance is partly a communication problem. Now, I would not say partly. It's a very much communication problem. If sustainability narratives are dominated by strategic ambiguity and greenwashing goes unchallenged, and governance fails eventually. If media and communication, the scrutiny, actions or research from you guys is robust and public discourse is well informed, then ESG governance works better overall in our society. So in that process, communication is not peripheral. It cannot be peripheral to the system. It's a very, very central and very, very critical. So what I'm asking you to consider is whether you might become decoders of sustainability communication. If I'm being bold, people who can distinguish between real environmental commitments and strategic storytelling, who can analyze how narratives are constructed and whose interests have served. So I chose that image, like decoders, deliberately. The most important function of communication research, I believe. Yeah, thank you very much for listening to me. It's a rich content a little bit, and I'm sorry that I didn't have many interactive moments, but I hope to have your questions, and then I hope to have more conversations during our lunch. Thank you very much.